Do you ever wonder how a man's life can turn in the span of a single heartbeat? It doesn't come with a shout or some grand sign from the heavens. Sometimes it starts with a whisper, soft, cold, and cutting, the kind that wraps around your bones and makes you pay attention. Samuel Cridge wasn't looking for salvation that day. Truth be told, he wasn't looking for much of anything. Just a bag of grain and a wagon part, the sort of simple errands that don't leave much room for surprises. He rode into Cold Creek the way a man wears an old coat, familiar, worn thin, offering little protection from the cold world around him. Now Samuel wasn't much for words. He'd gone a whole week without saying more than a polite nod. Silence was a companion he trusted. Silence didn't ask about the wife he'd buried under the cottonwood tree, or the mortgage stamped in heavy red ink sitting back home on the mantel. But that day, silence gave way. Behind the saloon, in a crooked alley where the dust collected like old sins, a crowd gathered, small, tense, and quiet. Not the kind of gathering where laughter spilled easy, but the kind where shame thickened the air. Folks glanced, then looked away quick as if staring too long might brand them with guilt, and that's when Samuel saw her. Eleanor Dumont stood in the dirt, belly swollen with child, dress patched and mud-streaked from travel. Her blonde hair, tangled and wild, framed a face too pale for summer. But it wasn't the hardship that held Samuel's eye. It was the way she stood there, silent, unbroken. Not begging. Not crying. Just enduring. Beside her, two men, brothers by blood or by marriage, sneered and bargained like she was livestock. One of them, bearded and sour with whiskey, turned to a fat merchant and said, "She's healthy enough. Child's near to term, strong stock if you need more hands come winter." The words hit like a slap, crude and cold. Eleanor didn't flinch. She stared at the cracked earth as if willing herself to disappear. "Now let me ask you, what would you have done? Looked away, like most did? Pretended you hadn't seen?" Samuel didn't plan on stepping forward. He didn't plan on doing much, at all. But sometimes the heart remembers what the mind forgets. Old wounds that never truly close. Samuel had buried a child once, and that pain never found peace. So he stepped closer. "How much you want?" he asked, voice low but steady. The brothers laughed, spit in the dirt. $50 and a rifle if you've got one." Samuel didn't haggle, didn't blink. He tossed a leather pouch at their feet and unhooked the Winchester from his back. The exchange was done without ceremony, quick and ugly. "She's yours now," they said, like the words could wipe their hands clean. But Samuel wasn't buying property. He was reaching out to something forgotten. Dignity, perhaps. Hope. He asked her name. For a long moment, she didn't speak. And when she finally did, it was small, cracked like river ice in spring. Eleanor Dumont. It wasn't much, just a name. But it was enough. Samuel offered his hand. She didn't take it, but she moved toward him. That was all he needed. They walked through town like two ghosts, shadows in the dying light. Folks pretended not to see. Guilt, after all, makes cowards of decent men. They didn't speak on the ride home. Silence hung between them, but it wasn't empty. It was heavy, real. A silence that spoke of things too hard for words, loss, endurance, maybe even a flicker of something neither dared name. And maybe that's how change really begins. Not with fire or fury, but with a whisper. A quiet act of defiance against a world that forgot how to be kind. Out here on the frontier, things don't happen the way they do in the storybooks. There's no grand speeches, no noble charges. Most days, change rides in quiet, dusty boots and speaks in words so soft they barely leave a mark on the air. Samuel Cridge was a man well acquainted with silence. It had been his only companion for years, since the day he buried his wife beneath the cottonwood tree and folded his heart into a tight, unbreakable knot. He wasn't the kind to meddle in other people's troubles. Trouble had a way of finding a man all on its own without him going out to greet it. But sometimes trouble looks a man in the eye and leaves him no choice. That day in Cold Creek, it wasn't the rough words of the men selling her or the hollow hush of the crowd that made Samuel step forward. It wasn't even the fact that the woman, heavy with child and barefoot in the dust, was being auctioned off like a sack of grain. It was her eyes. Eleanor Dumont didn't beg. She didn't plead. She just stared down at the earth, not broken, not proud, just there, holding herself together with the last scraps of dignity the world hadn't stripped away. And maybe Samuel saw something in her then, something he'd buried deep, a quiet kind of strength. The kind that doesn't cry out, doesn't falter, just endures. So he did what no one else in that town had the courage to do. How much? Samuel asked, his voice low and steady. The man who claimed to own her, her brother-in-law, sour-faced and mean-eyed, squinted at Samuel like he was sizing up a mule. $50 and a rifle, he said, voice thick with greed. Samuel didn't bargain. He didn't ask if it was fair. He didn't even ask Eleanor if she wanted saving. Because sometimes a man just knows what needs to be done. He tossed a leather pouch heavy with silver coins onto the dirt, unhooked the old Winchester from his back and laid it across his saddle horn. The man scooped up the money and the gun without a second thought. "She's yours now," he spat. But Samuel wasn't thinking about possession. He wasn't rescuing a damsel or paying off a debt. He was answering something older, deeper. The quiet call that tells a man he's got a chance just once to be decent in a world that isn't. He looked at her then, really looked, and said, "What's your name?" For a moment, she didn't move, didn't breathe. And then in a voice so small it could have been mist on the wind, she said, "Eleanor Dumont." It was the first thing she'd claimed for herself all day, her name. Samuel held out his hand. She didn't take it. She didn't have to. She stepped forward instead, just one small step, and somehow, it was enough. They walked out of town, side by side past faces that turned away, ashamed to meet their eyes. It's funny, isn't it, how easy it is for good people to look the other way when faced with someone else's sorrow. But Samuel didn't look away, and neither did Eleanor. They didn't speak as they left Cold Creek behind. The wagon creaked. The mule snorted and plodded along, stirring up little ghosts of dust, and between them stretched a silence that wasn't empty. It was full of things too big for words, loss, hurt, hope, all jumbled together in the soft hush of the prairie. And maybe you're wondering, why didn't she run? Why didn't she fight? But the truth is, sometimes survival isn't loud. Sometimes survival looks like one foot in front of the other, like breathing when it would be easier not to. Sometimes it looks like trusting a stranger because trusting yourself feels too far gone. That's the thing about the West. It's not built on big heroics. It's built on small mercies. A hand offered, a name given, a chance taken. Samuel Cridge wasn't a hero. Eleanor Dumont wasn't a damsel. But together, they stepped into a future neither one of them had dared imagine. And maybe, just maybe, that was how real beginnings were made. Not with noise, but with silence. Not with grand gestures, but with a quiet promise to stand side by side in a world that had tried to break them both. Out here on the prairie, life moves at the speed of trust, slow, careful, sometimes so quiet you might think nothing's happening at all. But that's how things grow in a place like this. Not in bursts or shouts, but inch by inch, like roots working their way into dry, stubborn soil. When Samuel Cridge led Eleanor Dumont to his ranch, there wasn't much to see. A sagging roof, a front porch missing a few boards, a stove that groaned when the wind leaned hard against the walls. It wasn't the kind of place to turn heads or make a man proud. But it was his. And now, in a way that neither of them could quite name, it was hers too. No words passed between them when they crossed the threshold. Samuel simply pointed to the bed, a narrow thing, worn but clean, and said, "It's yours if you want it. I'll take the barn. No questions, no pressure. Just space. The first real freedom Eleanor had been offered in a long time. In the beginning, they moved around each other like weathered cattle on a narrow trail. Cautious, deliberate, leaving enough room so no one had to flinch. Samuel kept his hands busy, chopping wood, patching fences, tending to the stubborn mule, while Eleanor folded herself into the quiet. She didn't speak much. She didn't smile. But she stayed. And staying, well, out here, that's a kind of bravery too. Eleanor didn't ask for anything, not even kindness. But Samuel, in his own quiet way, gave it anyway. A clean basin filled with water in the mornings. A plate of food set at the table, no words exchanged. Small things, barely noticeable if you weren't looking. But sometimes, small things are what hold a soul together. At first, she kept her distance. She moved slow and careful, like a woman learning how to live inside her own skin again. But bit by bit, she started leaving traces of herself behind. A broom leaned against the porch, a pot simmering low over the fire, a piece of mended cloth folded neatly by the stove. It wasn't grand. It wasn't loud. It was living. You know, a lot of folks think healing looks like lightning, bright, sudden, life-altering. But out here we know better. Healing looks like a field after a storm, muddy, battered, but still standing. It looks like showing up each day, doing the work, even when the hurt is too big to name. That's what Eleanor was doing. Samuel noticed it in the way she sat a little taller in her chair at supper. The way her hands, once tremulous and guarded, grew steady while she patched an old shirt. He noticed it one evening when the sun was dipping low and the sky turned a soft kind of gold, and he found her standing at the porch rail, humming. It was faint, a whisper of a melody, broken and brave. The kind of sound a person makes not because they're sure, but because they're trying. And he didn't say a word. He just kept working a piece of wood in his lap, carving slow and steady. Because out here, you learn not to spook something delicate. You let it come in its own time. In return, Eleanor didn't question Samuel's silences. She didn't pry into the places he wasn't ready to open. She just existed beside him, cooking small meals, mending clothes, sweeping dust that would only come back tomorrow. It wasn't about winning or losing, it was about surviving, about daring to believe that life could be more than just getting by, and little by little it was. There's something sacred about two broken souls learning to live beside each other without asking for too much. No expectations, no promises. Just the daily, stubborn act of choosing not to leave. One night, as the fire crackled low and the stars blinked against the black sky, Samuel caught himself watching Eleanor sew by the lamp. She wasn't smiling, but she wasn't frowning either. She was just there, real, steady, alive. And he realized, sometimes the hardest thing isn't saving someone else. It's letting yourself be saved by the simple, stubborn grace of another, human being refusing to give up. That's how it started for them. Not with fireworks or grand confessions, but with small kindnesses, repeated daily, until the cracks began to fill. Maybe that's how all real beginnings happen, not with a shout but with a whisper. Not with a storm, but with the slow, patient work of planting a seed in soil you never thought would bloom again. If you live long enough out on the plains, you learn a hard truth. The past has a way of finding you. It doesn't come with warning bells or flashing lights. It rides in quiet, just like the wind, slow, sure, and colder than you remember. For Samuel Cridge and Eleanor Dumont, the past came on horseback. It was a morning like any other. The sky pale and wide, the land still waking beneath a soft blanket of mist. Samuel was working the fence line, hammer in hand, when he caught sight of them. 3 riders cutting slow and deliberate across the field. Men who didn't bother, hiding their intentions. He didn't need a second look to know. Some things a man just feels in his gut. Eleanor stood on the porch, hands folded over her growing belly, her eyes steady and clear. She knew too. You could see it in the way she squared her shoulders, the way she set her jaw. Fear was there, sure as sunrise, but she wasn't about to run. Not this time. The riders pulled up close, dust settling around their boots. One of them tipped his hat in mock politeness. A man with a mean mouth and a colder heart, Eleanor's brother-in-law. "Afternoon," he drawled, though there was nothing friendly in it. "We come for what's ours." Samuel didn't blink. He didn't flinch. He just stood there, calm as a stone. "You came for trouble," he said. The man sneered. "You ain't got no papers, no preacher tied you to. Far as law sees it, she's still family, and that baby's blood runs with ours. Now, out here, law can be as thin as smoke. It's not always about right or wrong. More often, it's about who's willing to stand their ground." Samuel shifted the rifle on his shoulder, slow and easy. "She's not yours," he said, voice steady. "Never was." The man pulled out a folded paper, waved it like a flag. "Debts left behind by her late husband," he said, "land, livestock, and her." His smile was bitter, sharp. "Owed to us fair and square." Eleanor didn't wait for Samuel to answer. She stepped forward, not hiding behind him, but standing beside him. She looked that man straight in the eye and said, clear and strong, "You sold me. You gave up your rights the day you put a price on my head." Now there's a kind of silence that falls when truth is spoken plain. Heavy. Final. But men like that don't give up easy. His lip curled in a snarl. "You think this shack and that mule of a man will keep you safe? You think a name scrawled in the dirt changes anything?" And that's when Samuel spoke again. Slow, deliberate, every word carrying weight. "Married her yesterday morning. Pastor Evans, town clerk, witnessed it." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The man's face changed then. Not all at once, more like a slow cracking, a thing breaking from the inside out. He knew he was beaten, knew there'd be no claiming her without crossing a line he couldn't walk back from. Eleanor didn't back down. Didn't flinch. She lifted her chin and said, "I chose him. You can't own what chooses to be free." And there it was. Simple, strong, undeniable. Her brother-in-law spat in the dust, eyes burning. "You'll regret this," he muttered. "When the child's sick, when you're starving, you'll wish you'd come back." Eleanor held his gaze, steady as the earth. "Maybe," she said, "but I'll have this, standing my ground." The man turned his horse with a sharp tug on the reins, and the others followed, leaving a trail of dust and bitterness in their wake. Samuel lowered his rifle. Eleanor let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. And for a long moment, they just stood there side by side watching the past ride away. Now I reckon most folks think courage looks like a drawn gun or a loud stand. But out here we know better. Courage looks like standing still when you want to run. Looks like speaking truth even when your voice shakes. Looks like two people, battered but unbroken, choosing each other in the face of everything that says they shouldn't. That evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the land in gold, Samuel and Eleanor sat on the porch, side by side, not needing to say a word. Inside, a cradle waited, a quilt folded neat at its foot. Outside, the wind carried away the last echoes of a life Eleanor no longer owed. Because freedom, out here, isn't handed to you. It's claimed. And some folks, the best folks, earn it not with noise but with silence. Not with war, but with a quiet, stubborn choosing to belong only to themselves. There's a kind of rebuilding that can't be measured in lumber or nails. It's quieter than that, slower. The kind that happens in the space between two people learning how to trust again. After the dust settled and the past rode off, Samuel and Eleanor turned back to the land, the only thing out here stubborn enough to match them. The ranch wasn't much to look at. The roof still sagged in places and the fields wore their neglect like an old scar. But together, they started to piece it back together, one steady, deliberate act at a time. They mended fences, cleared brush, planted rows of tomatoes along the old fence line. Eleanor asked for lavender too, said she remembered the smell from when she was a girl, something soft to break up the dust and grit. Samuel didn't argue. He simply nodded and helped her turn. The hard earth. Work out here doesn't wait for grief or fear. It doesn't care about scars. It asks for your hands, your back, your patience, and maybe that's why it heals you in ways nothing else can. Slowly, Eleanor began to change. She moved with more surety, not the wary steps of someone waiting for the world to collapse under her feet, but the stride of someone who's decided to stay. She took to humming again. Not always. Not loud, but enough that it threaded through the walls of the house like a quiet blessing. You ever hear a woman hum to herself after forgetting how? It's a sound sweeter than any hymn. It's a sign that something lost has found its way home. Of course, the town had its whispers. Cold Creek wasn't known for minding its own business. Folks talked, they always do, said Samuel Cridge had. Bought himself a wife, said Eleanor Dumont must be touched in the head for staying with a man who could barely keep a roof from falling. Said worse things too, things that stuck to the air like dust after a long ride. But Samuel and Eleanor didn't pay them no mind. Because the truth is, when you've come through fire, a little smoke doesn't scare you anymore. They went to town, when they needed to, heads high but quiet, never inviting more talk than necessary. At the general store, Eleanor would stand tall, her husband's old hat low over her braid, her boots dusty but firm against the floorboards. She'd speak polite, take what she needed, pay with coins earned honest from the land they worked with their own two hands. And if the storekeeper's wife raised an eyebrow, or the blacksmith muttered under his breath, Eleanor didn't flinch. She knew what she was building couldn't be shaken by gossip, because it wasn't built on other people's opinions. It was built on soil, and work, and quiet trust, on a kitchen table set for two, on mended curtains fluttering in the breeze, on a cradle Samuel had crafted with his own hands waiting by the stove for the child soon to come. It's funny how the strongest things grow slow. Tomatoes creeping, up a crooked fence, lavender pushing through dry dirt, love stretching its roots deep where no one can see. One evening, as they sat on the porch, Eleanor turned to Samuel and said, "I never thought I'd feel safe again." Her voice was soft, but there was steel beneath it. "You're not safe," Samuel answered, because he was never one to sugarcoat a hard truth. "But you're not alone." And that was enough. It wasn't the kind of life folks wrote about in papers or sang about in ballads. No grand adventures, no gold strikes or duels at high noon. Just two people, scarred and stubborn, building something with bare hands and broken pasts. A life, a home. Out here, where the wind knows your secrets and the land remembers every footstep, that's more than enough. Out here, life has a way of testing you. Not with a single blow that knocks you off your feet, but with a steady, relentless press, like the wind, like the weight of dry earth refusing to yield. Samuel and Eleanor knew that kind of test all too well. The fire came on a night thick with silence. No thunderstorm, no warning. Just smoke curling up from the barn, thick and mean, as if the darkness itself had caught flame. Samuel smelled it before he saw it, the acrid sting in his nose, jolting him awake. By the time he pulled on his boots and grabbed the shotgun, the barn was already roaring, lit up against the prairie like a pyre. Somewhere behind him, Eleanor stood in the doorway. One hand wrapped around her heavy belly, the other clenched the frame. She didn't scream, didn't even call out. She just stood there breathing deep, watching a piece of their life burn. Samuel ran into the heat anyway. That's what a man does. He cut the mule free, slapped its flank to send it running, tried to save the tools, the feed. But the fire was too fast, too hungry. In the end, he could only stand with Eleanor and watch as the barn collapsed, the roof folding inward like a house of cards. By morning, there wasn't much left but ash and scorched earth. Neighbors trickled in. Some brought water, too late to matter. Others brought bread or blankets or silent, grim nods. Nobody said it aloud, but everyone knew. Someone had set that fire on purpose. Maybe a grudge, maybe a warning. The past has a nasty way of chasing folks who refuse to stay in their place. But Samuel didn't cuss, didn't throw a punch or raise his voice. He just turned from the smoldering wreckage, wrapped his arm around Eleanor's shoulders, and led her back into the house. And that night, under a bruised and battered sky, Eleanor went into labor. There was no luxury in it. No polished hospital rooms, no soft beds. Just boiling water, clean rags, and Samuel's steady hands. The neighbor woman who'd brought half the town's children into the world came too, whispering prayers and steadying Eleanor through the pain. Hours later, with the stars still hidden, behind smoke and cloud a child's cry split the silence. A boy, dark-haired, lungs strong. Eleanor wept when they placed him in her arms, a mixture of pain, relief, and something harder to name, a kind of defiant joy. Samuel didn't cry, but he did something rarer. He smiled, rough and real. You see, survival isn't just about holding on. Sometimes it's about daring to start over, and that's exactly what they did. The next morning, while the ashes were still warm, Samuel began gathering what was left. Neighbors brought timber, tools, food. The barn went up again, not as grand as before, but stronger, built with the kind of hands that know loss and don't scare easy. Eleanor planted tomatoes along the rebuilt fence, the same tomatoes that had withered once under the old sun. This time she planted lavender too, the scent drifting soft and steady around the house. It wasn't just for beauty. It was for remembering that even after fire and pain, something gentle could still grow. The boy thrived, laughed early, walked too soon. His first steps were on soil scorched clean, ground that had seen its share of battles and still held steady. Samuel built him a cradle with his own hands. Eleanor sewed quilts from scraps, each stitch a quiet prayer for a life stitched stronger than her own beginnings. Of course, the town talked. They always did. Said maybe Samuel Cridge wasn't the fool they thought. Said maybe Eleanor Dumont wasn't cursed after all. But Samuel and Eleanor didn't bother with gossip. They had better things to do, crops to tend, a boy to raise, a life to live. And if you ask me, that's the real miracle, not surviving the fire, but choosing to plant tomatoes and lavender in the ashes. Because out here, where the wind never forgets your name, and the earth remembers every step you take, hope isn't a thing you find. It's a thing you build, slow, steady, stubborn, and sometimes it grows sweeter after the burn. If there's one thing the land teaches you out here, it's that real things take time. Crops don't rise overnight, rivers don't carve canyons in a season, and healing, well, healing's the slowest work of all. Months passed on Samuel Cridge's ranch, and the air began to carry a different weight. Less like survival, more like living. The barn stood solid again, rough-hewn and proud. The tomatoes grew thick on the vine, and the lavender spilled soft purple along the porch rails, carrying its scent on every restless breeze. And the boy grew like wild grass after a spring rain, his laughter stitching itself into the very bones of the house. But even as life moved forward, there were things that needed setting right. Samuel and Eleanor had married before. Quick, quiet, a slip of paper signed in the back of a church, to fend off the men who would have claimed her like cattle. But this time was different. This time it wasn't about protection. It was about choice. So one Sunday, under the same cottonwood tree where Samuel's first wife Miriam lay resting, they stood before the small gathering of folks who called Cold Creek home. Not a crowd, but enough. Neighbors who had hammered nails into the new barn, women who had rocked the baby in the crook of their arms while Eleanor boiled beans on the stove. It wasn't a fancy affair. No music, no lace. Just a handful of wildflowers tucked behind Eleanor's ear and the steady way Samuel held her hand. Pastor Evans spoke plain words, simple and true, and when it came time to exchange vows, they didn't promise the moon or stars, just the things that mattered. To stand, to stay, to keep building the life they'd started from ash and grit. Afterward, Eleanor did something most wouldn't have expected. She walked, quiet and sure, over to the grave at the base of the cottonwood. She knelt, the boy balanced, against her hip, and laid a single wildflower at the headstone. No jealousy, no rivalry, just gratitude for the woman who had loved Samuel first, who had left behind a man who knew the price of love and didn't offer it lightly. Samuel stood, back watching, his hat pressed to his chest. No words passed between them, but none were needed. Out here, the land doesn't care for speeches. It listens for the things that happen when no one's watching. And the boy, they gave him both names, Cridge and Dumont, a stitching together of past and present, loss and hope. A reminder that families aren't just built from blood, but from the hard, patient work of loving what's broken without trying to fix it. In town, the talk changed again. Folks who once whispered now nodded their heads when they passed. They saw the way Samuel and Eleanor stood shoulder to shoulder at the store, how the boy clung to his mother's skirts and laughed when Samuel swung him up onto the mule's back. They weren't a scandal anymore. They were a story of two souls who chose each other, not because it was easy, but because it was right. And sometimes, on still evenings, when the wind barely stirred the tall grass and the horizon melted into gold, you could hear Eleanor sitting on the porch humming, not the broken hum from before, but a full melody now, stitched together with new memory and old hurt, hope rising through every note. Samuel would sit beside her, the boy asleep across his chest, and close his eyes. Not to forget the past, but to remember how far they'd come. Because out here, under a sky too big to hold all the stories it's been told, real love isn't written in poetry or carved in stone. It's built in soil and smoke and the quiet stubbornness of two people who refuse to quit. It's in a child's laughter, a hand held steady, a name whispered into the wind. And that's the kind of story that doesn't just get remembered. It gets lived. If you ask folks around Cold Creek about Samuel Cridge and Eleanor Dumont, they might just nod toward the hills, where the land rolls out wide and unbothered, and say something simple like, "They made it." You won't find their names written in the history books. No grand monuments stand in their honor. But if you walk the fields where their house once stood, where lavender still sways in the breeze and the earth remembers, you'll see the real record of their lives. Two people, each carrying wounds the world told them were too deep to heal, found a way to stitch something new from the frayed edges. They didn't have riches, they didn't have ease. What they had was the stubborn courage to stay, to plant tomatoes where the ground had burned, to build cradles from splintered wood, to sing again after forgetting how. Samuel, a man who had buried love once and thought he'd buried his heart with it. Eleanor, a woman sold and forgotten who refused to let the world decide her worth. Together they didn't just survive. They built a home, a family, a life stitched tight with the rough thread of hard work and quiet hope. Their love wasn't loud. It didn't announce itself with fireworks or grand declarations. It settled deep, like roots pressing into dry soil, slow and strong. It was in the way Samuel carved a swing for their boy, in the way Eleanor hummed as she hung laundry on the line, in the way they sat together on cool evenings, shoulder to shoulder, saying nothing because nothing needed saying. Some would call it ordinary, but out here, on land that remembers everything, ordinary can feel a lot like sacred. See, not all legacies are built with guns and gold. Some are written in calloused hands and long shadows at sunset. Some are carried in the smell of lavender and the laughter of children racing through dusty fields. Some are tied up in a simple piece of blue ribbon, frayed and worn, but still strong enough to hold everything together. Samuel and Eleanor didn't set out to change the world. They just wanted a corner of it where they could live free. Free from the ghosts of the past, free from the chains others tried to put on them. And somehow in the doing, they built something bigger than themselves. They built a testament to love, not as a feeling but as a choice made every day, to healing, not as a miracle, but as a stubborn refusal to stay broken, to life, not as a grand story, but as a quiet rising from the ashes. And maybe, just maybe, that's the kind of story worth telling, the kind that doesn't fade when the ink dries, because it's not written on paper. It's written on the land, In the soil and the dust, in the stretch of a child's name stitched from two pasts into one. Out here, where the wind never forgets and the earth holds every secret, Samuel and Eleanor's story lives on. Not in history, but in the hush between heartbeats, in the hum of an old song, in the stubborn, beautiful, ordinary miracle of beginning again.